Our next speaker is Ben Wilfond. You have slides?
I do.
Okay. I'll introduce him as he walks up. So Ben is the director of the Truman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics at Seattle Children's Research Institute, where he's also professor and chief of the Division of Bioethics in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Washington School of Medicine. Ben will talk to us about the policy analogs related to gene transfer in pediatric populations. Thanks for being here.
Actually, I only have two slides.
Could you push the button?
Very clever. So actually, because I only have two slides, I'm actually going to, which I did last night, I'm actually going to take the time to actually not add a slide, but tell one more story to begin with. And my story is actually not about pediatric gene transfer or about mitochondrial techniques. It's about, it was done in the context of prenatal genome sequencing. It was an editorial I wrote about an article that was published in the Hastings Center Report a couple of years ago on this topic, and my editorial was entitled Lessons from Winnie the Pooh. And I want to tell you about that only because it's actually relevant to these two topics as well, even though it was about a different topic. And so, and simply it was acknowledging that for those of you who are familiar with Winnie the Pooh, there's all these characters there, and two of the most, at least in my mind, memorable characters besides Christopher Robin are Tigger and Eeyore. And in many things in science, we often can divide ourselves between the Tiggers and the Eeyores. The Tigger's enthusiastic, everything is going to work, let's go full steam ahead, we're going to do it. And the Eeyores, it's all going to fall apart. This is horrible. And so this theme plays out over and over again in many issues in science, and it has been for decades. Christopher Robin, the main character of all those stories, he had the challenge of having to grow up and having to leave his friends. And even though he didn't want to do it, he actually did have to make progress in his life. And so when I wrote my essay, I was ending by talking about Christopher Robin and this idea of this deliberative approach going forward. As I was finishing the essay, I decided to do a little more reading about A.A. Milne, who wrote the stories about Christopher Robin. And I learned something actually quite interesting that's actually the most important thing about that story for me. What I didn't realize is that although the stories of Christopher Robin were written by his dad for him as a child to help him, Christopher Robin grew to resent his father and blamed much of his adult life, all of his woes, on those stories written to him as a child. And so I just want to point that out as one of the challenges of our attempts to sort of nurture our children, control our children, engage our children, and sometimes we get it wrong. And that's going to be true whether we're talking about writing stories or doing these types of techniques. So let me move to my next slide, which is my main slide, actually. And so what I want to do here is really talk about what I think are some of the lessons that we can think about from gene transfer research, particularly pediatric gene transfer research. My approach is going to be a bit more anecdotal. Rather than telling you the whole story of gene transfer research, I'm going to comment on each of these themes and what are the lessons from that. The first is the issue of oversight of clinical transition. The issue of when is it ready to go forward. This has already been talked about. This is clearly important. And certainly in the issue of human and gene transfer research, this was actually done because of concerns. The committee that was developed in the 70s, the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, took on the responsibility for making decisions about gene transfer research, at that time called gene therapy research. And again, it was initially a very elaborate process to make a decision when it was appropriate for the first trials to go forward. So I do think that one of the lessons from that experience is it might make sense to have some sort of group looking carefully and critically at the individual trial as an independent group. I think that perhaps served well in the beginning of that activity. That might be worthwhile here to have some independent people to look at this. As time has gone on, the role of the RAC has really shifted a lot. It no longer does that as we've gotten more experience. But at the time, in the early 90s, this was considered to be a very novel thing. Consider the ideal population condition. The first study in children was for a version of severe combined immunodeficiency, a very serious condition in children whom otherwise had an otherwise fatal condition. They could have a bone marrow transplant. This was meant as an approach that was being done in that context. So the idea here was that they were picking a situation that was otherwise fairly dire and making a decision to offer that at that time. I think another issue in terms of minimizing expectations of benefit for participants. I think one of the lessons from gene therapy is that there was a lot of hype in the 90s, and part of my background is as a pulmonologist taking care of patients with cystic fibrosis. The amount of enthusiasm about gene therapy for cystic fibrosis was huge. And there was just this imagination that within years, everybody with cystic fibrosis would be cured by gene therapy. And there's a lot of reasons for why that occurred, but what's interesting is that over time the community really felt betrayed and deceived by the scientific community because they were let down from their expectations. So I think the issue of managing expectations is going to be very important, both from the point of view of the population as well as from the point of view of the scientists. This won't be Tigger, it won't be Eeyore, but we have to figure out how to manage those expectations realistically. Similarly, I think that this is a place where I agree with Lori. We should expect that harms will occur, even with efforts at minimization. And again, that's not a reason not to do things, but we ought not to pretend that there won't be problems, and that will be part of our process. I think another issue is the idea of involving the community in planning research. You know, this is something we talk about a lot. This will certainly be important. I think it was fantastic that we began the whole session hearing from a family and hearing from a family's perspective, because that really is at the heart of these issues. And the involvement of communities who will be the recipients of this type of research are critical to how we do things. And I think over time, that has become one of the issues in gene therapy. Particularly muscular dystrophy is a good example where there's been much more active involvement of the communities in thinking about the research and trying to think through the research agenda. I think another lesson from gene therapy research is to anticipate professional and financial conflicts of interest. There's a lot of different reasons for the scientific enthusiasm, but one of the reasons for the scientific enthusiasm was the possibility of making money. And, you know, in the beginning, and there was an appreciation that those people who were involved initially in gene transfer research were developing companies. They had a lot of reasons to believe this was going to be financially very lucrative. And so I'm just pointing out we need to be thoughtful about that issue, and that's going to be an issue to be dealt with, not one that's not resolvable, but one that we need to be mindful of because it will come up again. Consider direct assessment of parental understanding and the consent process. One of my experiences with gene transfer research was for a study involving a phase 1 trial of adolescents with cystic fibrosis. So this was involving children from the age of 12 on up with cystic fibrosis who would be receiving gene transfer through a bronchoscopy. And the issue here was that this was originally not approved by the RAC because of the concern that this was being done in kids, not adults. This particular approach had not been yet done in adults. The concern was the adults would be too sick for there to be any sort of response. And they were looking, although it was a safety issue, they were looking for some sort of response. My role was actually, I was on the data monitoring committee for this project. And so in the end, what we ended up doing is developing a very explicit approach to consent monitoring that involved having somebody talk to families after they had agreed to be in the study to verify what they actually understood. And again, this was not something we do for every research study, but this idea of consent monitoring, of hearing back from the people what their expectations are, what their understanding is, could be a worthwhile thing to think about for these types of approaches. Finally, consider a name for the research that addresses concerns and expectations. You know, I'm not quite sure what we'll call this, mitochondrial replacement therapy, novel techniques, but we should be thoughtful about what we call it, because the names we use will have some impact on how this is perceived by the public. And so I don't have an answer, but that's, I think, another lesson, because again, initially going from gene therapy to gene transfer was a very important semantic issue to clarify where the state of the science was. So I do have one very quick slide. When I was preparing for this, I was given some questions to be thinking about. These have already been covered by other things, so I'm going to say 3 quick points about these 3 issues. They've already been said, so I'll be very brief about them. You know, I do think that in terms of this question about balancing uncertainties with the potential harms and benefits, you know, this, as people point out, we face this issue all the time. And I think here we need to think about our procedural mechanisms, including oversight of transition, study design, population selection, and assessment of consent. I think we can rely on those procedural approaches to try to deal with this concern. The issue of avoiding problematic downstream applications, again, here's my quick summary of the somatic germline distinction, which I agree it was a very simple, clear way to address concerns. As we've heard from a number of speakers, it doesn't do the work we expect it to do. The other thing I'll point out, though, because this was mentioned earlier today, that I want to address really briefly, and I've got 41 seconds left, is the issue of the concern about children with disabilities, and the concern about to what extent will these therapies have an adverse impact on children with disabilities. We've had prenatal diagnosis for trisomy 21 and trisomy 18 and 13 for decades now. And through Jeff Botkin, I've gotten very interested in the issues related to trisomy 18 and 13, and it's been quite impressive to see a gradual shift in attitudes and acceptance of these children over decades, in spite of the fact that we've had prenatal diagnosis for years. So we have to be mindful of this issue, but it's not the fact that because we have a new technology, it will result in those concerns, which I hold very strongly as being a worry, but I think they can be resolved. And finally, I think this issue of fairness, equity, and access is a generic problem for all of medicine and is not unique here. And I'm 6 seconds over, so I'll stop.
Thank you. Well done. So